This is Susanna Highmore, painted sometime between 1740 and 1745 by her father, the British artist Joseph Highmore. Susanna was born in 1725, so in this portrait she is certainly under 20 and looks more likely to be around 16 or 17. The portrait is in oils on canvas and is not particularly large. Unframed, it is just over 90 centimetres tall and a little more than 70 centimetres wide. Today it is in the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia. Joseph Highmore, who was born in 1692 and died in 1780, was a successful painter of portraits and conversation pieces, genre works, and historical and biblical subjects. His patrons were drawn from both the upper and middle classes. His ability to catch a likeness, to convey personality and character, and to manage the complexities of group portraits made him popular, as did the speed and reliability with which he worked. He was also a writer on art, a critic, and an art historian. Susanna was one of 2 children. Her older brother, Anthony, later became an artist like his father. Susanna was named after her mother, Susanna Hiller, who married Joseph Highmore in 1716. She, the mother, seems to have been very intellectual, and was known for writing poems, though little of her work survives. Susanna evidently passed her intellectual gifts on to her daughter, who was known from an early age for her lively intelligence. Her father, meanwhile, cultivated her artistic talents. The Highmores, inspired by John Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education of 1693, gave both their children a high standard of education. Locke argued that children should be given more freedom and less restriction, that their interests and aptitudes should be stimulated and encouraged, and that the purpose of education was to create not narrow scholars, but well-rounded individuals, and the Highmores sought to follow those principles. Susanna was tutored at home by both her mother and her father. Accounts of her by friends and family show that she loved learning, loved gaining knowledge and skills, and was proud of her ability to do so. Roland Freeman, a family friend, records her proficiency in several languages and her early development as a poet, writer, and artist. The Highmores had many literary interests and friendships, which led to the development of a sort of salon, with meetings and readings taking place at their house in London and the houses of their friends. Susanna took full part in these events as she grew older. This print is based on a drawing she made of one such gathering, with the novelist Samuel Richardson reading from the manuscript of his novel Sir Charles Grandison at his house in Fulham. Richardson was a family friend, and his novel Pamela inspired a series of paintings by Joseph Highmore. As this image shows, there was an important social and indeed flirtatious side to these events. Richardson was even heard to complain on one occasion that those present at a reading were paying more attention to each other than they were to his work. 2 marriages would emerge from the gathering shown here, including, eventually, Susanna's own, to the man sitting beside her, John Duncombe, a young clergyman and writer. Susanna Highmore certainly attracted many admirers. They paid her attention, and they wrote her poems. When her father painted her portrait and put it on display in his house, that, too, attracted much admiration. William Dodd, an Anglican clergyman and a man of letters, but also a rather dubious character who came to a bad end, not satisfied with writing poems to Susanna, wrote and published one to her portrait as well. This portrait is a proud father's celebration of his daughter's liveliness and beauty, but also of her character and the richness of her personality. He places her at the centre of a world of her own. The portrait does not show her as demure, passive, an object to be admired with no agency of her own. Instead, we see strength and self-confidence, even a provocative willfulness, as Susanna looks out at us with a clear, direct gaze, full of life, and surrounded by evidence of her own achievements and by the things she loves: pets, books, art. The portrait celebrates Susanna for herself, but it is a celebration of parental achievement as well. She is her own person, but she is also her parents' creation through their careful nurturing and their Lockean program of child-raising and education. The image of Susanna is an embodiment of Locke's advice that parents should encourage their children's inclinations and aptitudes and provide them with plentiful enjoyment of whatsoever might innocently delight them. Susanna is shown at 3/4 length, her left side outwards, her body in profile to show her fashionable silhouette, and her head turned towards the viewer. The unseen light source beyond the edge of the canvas to the left illuminates the scene with a warm, even light, picking out highlights along the edge of the table, in the brasswork of the parrot's perch, in Susanna's hair, and in the pearls she wears. The position of her head is one recommended as suitable for portraits of girls and young women. Thomas Page, in his 1720 book, The Art of Painting, writes, "Let their postures be very graceful and airy, their heads gently turned a little, in a sort of reigning manner, bearing their chin against their neck, which looks charming and graceful." Her face is dominated by her red-lipped mouth and her large, dark eyes. The underpainting of her face is in a pale blue-grey, against which highlights and contours have been worked up in tones ranging from a rich pink on her cheeks to a pale golden-tinted ivory across her forehead. She is dressed in a fine silk dress, either black or very dark blue, with pink turned-back cuffs and rich lace embellishments. Her hair is elaborately styled with a pink ribbon and a string of pearls. A loop of the pearls can be seen below her right cheek. She is standing in front of a small, elegantly ornamented table. Appropriately for a lady of literary interests, there is a bookcase on her right, and on the table itself are two very contented-looking cats. They were called Brew and Cato. Susanna was known for her love of cats throughout her life. Above them perches her pet parrot, Poll, who, like her mistress and at her request, was the recipient of a poem published in the Gentleman's Magazine, April 1750. Behind Susanna is a bright red curtain, which provides a background from which her dark-clad figure seems to move forward towards the viewer. The contrast between the two gives the painting richness, but is mediated and softened by the pink at her sleeve and the pale silvery greys of her lace and her pearls. Researchers at the National Gallery of Victoria have recently discovered that the curtain was originally intended to be a dark blue, but that Highmore changed it at some point to the bright vermilion we see today, presumably both to strengthen the overall colour balance and because the black or dark blue dress would have been rather lost against a blue curtain. The red also echoes the red of Poll's face, the labels on the backs of the books, the red in the miniature Susanna holds in her hand, and the red of her lips against her pale face. The fingers of Susanna's left hand are laid lightly on the top of the table, strengthening her pose. She seems to be laying claim to the space around her and the many things it contains. Prominent on the tabletop, lying open as if she has just been leafing through it, is a scrapbook. Two figures can be seen on its pages, a lady and a gentleman, drawn and coloured, then cut out and pasted onto the pages. And, remarkably enough, some of Susanna's cut-out figures have survived, having been passed down through the Highmore family, and are in the collections of the Tate Gallery in London. Susanna holds another example of her artistic skills in her right hand, an oval miniature of a lady in colourful and rather exotic costume, with an elaborately decorated cap, a loose mantle or robe of blue over a red garment, and unbound tresses of long brown hair. It is almost certainly in watercolour on ivory, well-established media for miniature portraits. It can be assumed that the original was finer in execution and richer in detail. There are various reasons why a person might be shown in a portrait holding a miniature. Most commonly, the miniature is itself a portrait of a person of importance to the sitter, a spouse or lover, or a son or daughter. In this case, however, the picture is being held up as evidence of Susanna's artistic skills and achievements, just as in this self-portrait by the engraver George Virtue, a fellow artist of Joseph Highmore and a fellow Royal Academician, who is shown surrounded by symbols of his status as an artist, holding up and indicating the products of his skill. The prominence given to the miniature in Susanna's portrait, both in its positioning on the canvas and Susanna's manner of holding it up as if for the viewer's, perhaps for her father's, approval, suggests that it is the focus of the composition intended to draw our eye. It is impossible to identify the sitter, or to know whether this is a copy or an original composition, but it is clearly all her own work, perhaps her first completed portrait. Miniature painting was believed to be a particularly suitable pursuit for female artists, further reinforcing the appropriateness of this artistic display. The portrait shows Susanna Highmore at the beginning of her career as an artist. She continued with that career, producing drawings and watercolours and illustrations for books by her father and family friends. She was also a poet, although her surviving published work numbers fewer than 20 items. She was active in the cultural life of her times, keeping up a lively correspondence with friends and literary and artistic contemporaries. As already mentioned, she married the literary clergyman John Duncombe, who came from a family who were long-standing friends of the Highmores. The two had known each other since childhood. In 1754, Duncombe published the Feminiad, or Female Genius, a celebration of women writers and poets, in which he eulogized Susanna as Eugenia, describing her as the muse's pupil from her tenderest years, which helped to further her reputation as an artistic and literary prodigy. He was a regular presence at the Highmores' literary salons, and after a long courtship, he and Susanna were married in 1761, when she was 36. Duncombe was a member of the cathedral clergy at Canterbury, and the couple settled there. Susanna gave up writing on her marriage, but continued her artistic activities, providing illustrations for publications by her husband and his circle. They had 3 children, but only one, Anna Maria, survived to adulthood. Susanna was widowed in 1786 and lived out the rest of her years in a house in the cathedral precincts in Canterbury. The clerical establishment regarded her as eccentric and difficult, by which they seem to have meant that she did not show them the respect to which they felt they were entitled. She was certainly someone of strong character and individuality, who did not particularly care what other people thought of her, and who was known for her devotion to her daughter and to her cats. She died in 1812, in her 87th year.